Most people don't struggle because they lack intelligence or effort. They struggle because no one ever explained the rules that quietly govern human behavior. If you've ever felt overlooked despite doing things right, misunderstood while trying to be reasonable, or drained from playing fair in situations that weren't designed to be fair, this channel is for you. Unspoken Laws doesn't teach manipulation. It reveals the dynamics already shaping outcomes, whether you see them or not. Here, we replace confusion with clarity, not to make you harder, but to help you move through the world without losing yourself. Let's begin. There's a moment many people recognize, even if they've never named it. You work steadily. You show up early. You take responsibility when others avoid it. And yet, somewhere along the way, the respect you expected to accumulate simply doesn't. Not dramatically, not with open hostility, just a quiet absence. Conversations move past you. Decisions are made without you in the room. Your reliability becomes assumed rather than acknowledged. What once felt like contribution starts to feel like extraction. And the most confusing part is that nothing obvious went wrong. You didn't slack. You didn't change your values. You didn't stop caring. What's rarely said is that effort and respect don't operate on the same axis. They intersect at first, then slowly drift apart. Early on, hard work is visible. It signals intent. It buys you entry. People notice. They nod. They approve. But over time, effort alone stops communicating value. It becomes background noise. And when effort continues without clear boundaries, it quietly reframes how others perceive you. Not as dependable in a strong way, but as available. This isn't about punishment for being conscientious. It's about how human systems adapt. Most social environments reward what is contained, not what is endless. They respond to signals of self-respect before they respond to signals of sacrifice. And when someone consistently gives without friction, the system doesn't interpret that as nobility. It interprets it as stability it can lean on. Quietly, without announcement, expectations shift. Tasks accumulate. Requests become assumptions. The tone changes, not because anyone decided to diminish you, but because your role stabilized in a way that removed tension. And tension, uncomfortable as it is often what preserves recognition. This is where many thoughtful people feel disoriented. They were taught that consistency would speak for itself, that fairness would be reciprocated, that restraint would be respected. And when that doesn't happen, the instinct is to try harder, to clarify intentions, to prove worth through even more effort. But effort isn't what's missing. What's missing is clarity about the unspoken exchange that's been taking place all along. And once that becomes visible, something subtle begins to settle. Not anger, not blame, just understanding. We'll stay there for a moment. When effort stops translating into respect, the first reaction is usually internal. People look inward. They question their tone, their competence, their likability. They replay conversations, searching for the moment they must have misstepped. But what's rarely examined is the structure around them. Most environments don't consciously evaluate character. They respond to patterns. And patterns, once established, are hard to interrupt. When someone becomes known as reliable, reasonable, endlessly cooperative, that identity settles into place without friction. Others stop actively perceiving it, not out of malice, but because the mind conserves attention for what feels uncertain. What never resists is rarely reassessed. Over time, effort becomes invisible not because it lacks quality, but because it lacks contrast. This is where the confusion deepens. The person doing the work still feels the cost, the energy spent, the restraint exercised. But from the outside, it no longer registers as effort at all. It registers as the baseline. And baselines don't command respect. They define expectations. What's quietly happening is a shift from recognition to reliance, from appreciation to assumption. The system begins to lean on you, not look up to you. This isn't about being taken advantage of in a dramatic sense. It's subtler than that. It's about how roles harden. Once you are seen as the one who absorbs pressure, resolves tension, fills gaps without complaint, the environment adapts around that certainty. And certainty, while useful, is not the same as authority. Authority carries a sense of limit. It implies choice. When effort is freely given without visible containment, it stops signaling choice. it signals obligation. And obligation does not invite respect, it invites dependency. Many people sense this, but don't have language for it. They feel a low-grade resentment, quickly suppressed. A fatigue that doesn't come from the work itself, but from the mismatch between contribution and recognition. They tell themselves they shouldn't feel this way, that wanting respect is ego, that being dependable is its own reward. But this isn't about ego, it's about alignment. Human systems, whether at work or in relationships, are constantly recalibrating around perceived boundaries, not spoken ones, energetic ones. When those boundaries blur, so does the signal of self-respect. And when self-respect becomes ambiguous, others unconsciously fill in the gaps, often incorrectly. This is why simply working harder rarely restores respect. It reinforces the very pattern that diluted it. The environment doesn't suddenly realize it has misjudged you. It simply benefits more efficiently from what it already expects. Understanding this doesn't require cynicism. It requires clarity. Because once you see that respect responds to containment rather than exhaustion, something shifts internally. The pressure to over-explain, over-deliver, over-correct begins to loosen. Not because you care less, but because you start noticing what the system has been responding to all along. And that awareness changes the way effort lands. There's a quiet moment that often follows this realization. Not relief, not resolve, just a pause. Because once you notice that effort alone doesn't hold meaning, you start to see how often you've been compensating for something no one asked you to compensate for. You filled silence before it was uncomfortable. You smoothed tension before it clarified anything. You stayed available because it felt responsible, even when no one had questioned your commitment. What's rarely acknowledged is that restraint communicates as much as action, sometimes more. In most social systems, meaning is created not by what is given, but by what is withheld with intention. Not in a manipulative way, in a clarifying way. When someone chooses not to fill every gap, others are forced to recalibrate. They notice absence. They reassess value. They begin to perceive choice where they once assumed inevitability. This is uncomfortable for people who equate goodness with responsiveness, who were taught that being useful was the same as being respected. But usefulness is a function. Respect is a perception. Perception forms around contrast, not consistency. Around moments where effort is present, then absent. Where engagement is deliberate rather than automatic. Without that contrast, contribution blends into the background, no matter how sincere it is. Many thoughtful people resist this idea because it feels like a betrayal of their character. They worry that pulling back means becoming cold, unkind, or calculating. But that fear misunderstands what's actually being asked of them. This isn't about becoming less considerate. It's about becoming more contained. Containment is what allows others to feel the weight of your presence. When you are always there, your presence has no edge. When you are selectively there, it acquires shape. And shape is what the mind registers as authority. Authority doesn't announce itself. It's inferred. It's inferred when someone doesn't rush to prove their worth. When they allow moments to stand unresolved. When they don't absorb discomfort that doesn't belong to them. These aren't tactics. They're signals of internal alignment. And systems respond to alignment. Often, this is the turning point where people feel a subtle internal conflict. Part of them senses that something needs to change. Another part fears the social cost of changing it. They imagine backlash, rejection, being misunderstood. And sometimes, that fear is justified. Because not every environment respects clarity. Some prefer compliance. But that response too is information. When effort is withdrawn slightly and respect collapses entirely, it reveals something important about the structure you're in, not about your worth, but about the terms that were silently governing your role. Seeing this clearly doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't require explanation. It only requires noticing where your energy goes and how little resistance it meets. Because respect doesn't grow where effort disappears. It grows where effort has shape. And once you begin to sense that difference, it becomes harder to ignore the places where you've been dissolving yourself into systems that never learned how to see you. At this point, something subtle often surfaces. Not a plan, not a decision. A discomfort with how familiar the pattern has become. You begin to notice how often your presence is assumed rather than invited. how your agreement is anticipated before it's given, how your silence is read as consent, not consideration. None of this happens because others are deliberately overstepping. It happens because the system has learned you won't interrupt it. Most people don't realize how much respect is maintained by interruption, not loud interruption. Structural interruption. When a pattern runs without resistance, it becomes invisible. When it's gently disrupted, it becomes noticeable again. And noticeability is the beginning of renegotiation. This is why people who are quietly authoritative often appear less busy. Not because they do less, but because their effort is contained within clear edges. Their availability has rhythm, their contribution has punctuation. And those pauses do something important. They force others to orient. For someone who has built their identity around reliability, this feels counterintuitive. Pausing can feel like neglect. Silence can feel like irresponsibility. Allowing others to feel the absence of your intervention can feel like letting something fail. But what's rarely said is that constant intervention prevents systems from revealing their true shape. When you always step in, you absorb pressure that was meant to signal imbalance. And without that signal, nothing adjusts. Respect doesn't emerge from martyrdom. It emerges from proportion. Proportion between what you give and what you protect. Many people were never taught that self-respect is legible, that it communicates even when nothing is said, that others read it through pacing, tone, and what you do not rush to offer. And when self-respect is unclear, others unconsciously fill in the meaning, usually in ways that benefit them. This is where clarity becomes more important than kindness. Not because kindness is a flaw, but because kindness without clarity becomes self-erasing. It smooths over boundaries until there's nothing left to respond to. You may notice that the people who command the most respect are not always the most skilled or the most generous. They are the ones whose energy feels settled, whose attention feels deliberate, who do not overextend to secure approval. They don't push, they don't explain. They simply occupy their role with consistency and limit. And that limit creates gravity. For someone who has been overlooked despite effort, this can be an unsettling observation. It suggests that respect was never withheld because you lacked value. It faded because your value was too easy to access, too evenly distributed, too predictable. That realization can sting, but it also frees you. Because if the issue was never your capability, then nothing about who you are needs to be abandoned. Only the way your energy has been structured. And structure is something you can become aware of without forcing change. Once this settles in, another layer becomes visible, not outside of you, inside. You begin to notice how quickly you move to make things easier for others, how instinctive it is to absorb discomfort, to soften edges, to take responsibility before it's clearly yours. This isn't weakness, it's conditioning, a learned reflex that once kept things stable. But stability and respect are not the same outcome. Stability keeps systems running. Respect defines how you are positioned within them. Many people confuse the two because they were rewarded early for being agreeable. They were praised for being mature, flexible, low maintenance. Over time, those traits became part of their identity. And identities, once formed, quietly dictate behavior, even when the environment has changed. What's rarely examined is the cost of that identity. When you consistently make yourself easy to work with, easy to rely on, easy to approach, you also make yourself easy to overlook. Not because ease lacks value, but because the mind stops tracking what feels endlessly available. Attention shifts toward what feels scarce, bounded, self-directed. This isn't about becoming difficult. It's about becoming distinct. Distinctness requires containment. It requires allowing your effort to be felt rather than smoothed over. It requires tolerating small amounts of friction without rushing to resolve them. For someone used to being the stabilizer, this can feel deeply uncomfortable. Friction triggers guilt. Silence triggers anxiety. You may worry that pulling back will harm relationships, damage your reputation, or expose you to judgment. And sometimes it will. But what's quietly revealed in those moments is something important. Which connections were sustained by mutual regard and which were sustained by your overextension? Which roles respected your presence and which depended on your disappearance into function? This awareness can feel sobering, even lonely, yet it's also the beginning of a different internal posture. One where you no longer measure your worth by how much you carry, but by how deliberately you engage, where you notice when effort is aligned with respect and when it's simply filling space. Most people never pause long enough to feel this distinction. They stay busy, they stay useful, they stay tired, and they tell themselves, that's just how responsible adults live. But underneath that story, something else has been asking for recognition. A quieter sense that effort should have shape, that contribution should have boundaries, that respect should not require self-erasure. When you allow that sense to exist without immediately acting on it, something shifts, not externally yet. Internally, you begin to feel where your energy naturally wants to stop, where your agreement wants to slow, where your silence is not avoidance, but alignment. And that internal alignment, once it stabilizes, begins to register outwardly. As this alignment settles, you may notice a change in how situations feel before anything visibly changes around you. A subtle hesitation where there used to be automatic compliance. A pause where your body once leaned forward without question. These moments are quiet, but they matter because they mark the return of choice. For a long time, effort may have felt compulsory, not because anyone forced you, but because your sense of self became entangled with being dependable. Saying yes felt safer than risking misinterpretation. Showing restraint felt riskier than absorbing the load. And over time, that pattern hardened into something that felt like character. But character is not the same as compulsion. When effort is driven by compulsion, it loses its signal. Others don't experience it as generosity. They experience it as certainty. And certainty invites assumption, not respect. This is where many people misunderstand what's happening when they begin to pull back. They assume they are becoming less generous, less engaged, less committed. But what's actually happening is that their engagement is becoming legible. It is no longer ambient. It is no longer everywhere at once. It has edges. Edges create meaning. They tell others where you end and where their responsibility begins. Without those edges, systems blur, roles overlap, and the person with the highest tolerance for discomfort becomes the default container for everyone else's imbalance. This isn't sustainable. And on some level, you already know that. You may have felt it as exhaustion that sleep didn't fix, as irritation that didn't match the situation, as a quiet resentment you didn't want to admit to yourself. These weren't signs of ingratitude. They were signals that your internal boundaries had been overridden for too long. What's rarely said is that boundaries don't start as statements. They start as sensations. A tightening in the chest when you agree too quickly. A heaviness when you take on something that isn't yours. A dullness when your contribution disappears into expectation. When those sensations are ignored, the body carries what the mind won't name. And over time, that carrying erodes presence. You become functional, but less felt. Useful, but less respected. Respect responds to presence. Presence requires containment. As you begin to honor those internal signals, even quietly, your energy changes. You stop filling every silence. You stop preempting every problem. You allow moments of uncertainty to exist without rushing to resolve them. Others may feel this before they understand it. Conversations may slow. Requests may become more deliberate. Some people may feel unsettled by the change, not because you've done anything wrong, but because the structure they relied on has shifted. This is not something you announce. It's something you inhabit. And as you do, effort begins to regain its weight, not because you're doing less, but because what you do is no longer automatic. It is chosen, and choice is what restores meaning to contribution. We'll stay with that feeling, because it's where a different kind of respect begins to form. At this stage, something else becomes apparent. Respect doesn't return all at once. It reappears in fragments. A question asked where there used to be an assumption. A pause before a request. A moment of eye contact that lingers a little longer. These are small signals, but they matter. They indicate that others are reorienting, not consciously, structurally. They are recalibrating around a presence that now has limits. This is often where people feel tempted to explain themselves, to justify the change, to reassure others that they are still the same person, still kind, still committed, still safe. But explanation dissolves the signal. When you explain a boundary too quickly, you turn it back into availability. You invite negotiation before the new structure has settled. And respect, at this stage, is still fragile. It needs consistency more than reassurance. What's rarely said is that clarity feels uncomfortable at first, not because it's wrong, but because it removes ambiguity others were benefiting from. And when ambiguity disappears, people must adjust their own behavior. That adjustment can feel like loss. Some will respond with respect, some with distance, some with subtle resistance. None of these reactions are something you need to manage. They are information. For a long time, you may have believed that maintaining harmony was your responsibility, that if something felt tense, you had failed. That smoothness was a sign of maturity. But harmony built on self-erasure is not harmony. It's quiet imbalance. Real stability can tolerate pause. It can tolerate friction. It can tolerate someone not rushing to absorb what isn't theirs. As you hold this line, gently and without explanation, you may notice something internal strengthening, a sense of self-respect that doesn't need to be validated, a calm that isn't performative, a steadiness that comes from not being everywhere at once. This is where quiet authority begins to take root, not as a posture, not as a strategy, as a byproduct of coherence. Your words become fewer but more precise. Your presence becomes less diffuse. You are no longer reacting to the system's demands in real time. You are responding from a place that feels settled. Others feel this shift, even if they can't articulate it. And over time, they adjust their expectations accordingly, not because you demanded it, because the structure no longer supports the old pattern. This is also where discernment sharpens. You begin to see which environments respond to clarity with respect, and which respond with pressure, which relationships expand when you step back slightly, and which collapse. This isn't something to judge, it's something to notice, because respect that only exists when you overextend was never really respect. It was reliance. And reliance, once exposed, cannot be mistaken for regard again. Staying present through this phase requires patience. The system needs time to relearn you, and you need time to trust that you don't have to earn visibility through exhaustion. Effort still matters, but now it lands. There is often a quieter challenge that emerges here, not external resistance, internal temptation. The temptation to return to the old rhythm when things feel uncertain, when silence stretches longer than expected, when recognition doesn't immediately follow restraint. The mind looks for familiar ground. The body remembers the relief of being needed. This is where many people undo the shift without realizing it, not because they don't understand what's happening, but because they mistake discomfort for danger. They assume that if respect doesn't arrive quickly, it never will. And so they step back into over-functioning, smoothing the edges they had just allowed to form. But respect doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to stability. When you stop overextending, there is often a lag, a period where the system hasn't yet recalibrated, and you haven't yet learned to rest inside your own containment. This gap can feel empty, even lonely, especially for those whose sense of connection was tied to usefulness. What's rarely acknowledged is that this emptiness isn't absence. It's space. Space where your presence can finally be felt as presence, not function. During this phase, it's common to feel less visible before you feel more respected, less consulted before you are taken more seriously. This isn't regression. It's the system testing the new shape, seeing if the old expectations still apply. Consistency matters here, not rigidity, not withdrawal, just quiet steadiness. You continue to contribute where it feels aligned. You decline where it doesn't, without drama. You allow others to experience the weight of their own responsibilities. You let moments resolve themselves without your intervention. This can feel like doing nothing, but it isn't. It's allowing proportion to re-establish itself. Internally, something important is happening as well. Your self-respect is no longer dependent on immediate feedback. You begin to feel whole without being constantly engaged. Your nervous system settles into a slower rhythm, one that doesn't spike at every request or expectation. This internal steadiness is what others eventually respond to, not your absence, your coherence. When effort comes from coherence, it carries a different tone. It's not rushed, it's not defensive, it doesn't seek validation, and that tone communicates more than words ever could. People may not praise it, they may not even mention it, but they adjust. They speak differently, they listen more closely, they consider your time, and even when they don't, You no longer experience their behavior as a referendum on your worth, because you've stopped outsourcing that measure. This phase requires trust, not in others, in yourself. Trust that you don't need to rush the outcome. That respect, when it returns, does so quietly, and that even if it doesn't in certain places, you now have the clarity to see why. That clarity changes what you tolerate. With that clarity, another shift becomes possible. Not dramatic, almost imperceptible. You begin to recognize that respect was never something you could chase or convince others into offering. It was something that emerged when your inner posture and your outward behavior stopped contradicting each other, when what you felt inside finally matched what you allowed outside. For a long time, many people live with that contradiction. They feel the cost of overextension, but present endless capacity. They feel the need for space, but communicate constant availability. And the system responds to what is communicated, not what is felt. When that contradiction dissolves, your presence simplifies. There is less internal negotiation, fewer silent compromises. You are no longer deciding in every moment whether to protect yourself or be perceived as good. The choice becomes quieter, more settled. This is often when others begin to describe you differently, not necessarily with compliments, with tone, with timing, with restraint. They may approach you with more care, or they may approach you less often, but more intentionally. Both are forms of respect. What's important is that you no longer need to decode every interaction for signs of approval or rejection. You're not scanning for proof that the shift is working. You're noticing something more stable, your own sense of proportion. You know when effort is aligned. You know when it isn't. And that knowing reduces reactivity. You stop feeling compelled to correct misunderstandings immediately. You stop defending your intentions. You let people form their impressions without rushing to manage them. This doesn't make you distant. It makes you grounded. Grounded people are harder to misplace in a system. They don't blur into function. They don't disappear into utility. Their presence has weight because it's not scattered. There may still be moments of doubt, situations where the old reflex surfaces, where you feel the pull to step in, smooth over, take on more than you should. But now, you recognize that pull for what it is. A habit, not a requirement. And habits can loosen when they're no longer justified. At this point, the question quietly changes. It's no longer, why don't they respect me? It becomes, where does my effort actually belong? And that question is far more stabilizing. Because respect that depends on exhaustion is fragile, but respect that emerges from alignment is resilient. It doesn't need to be maintained through constant proof. It holds even when you're silent, even when you're not performing usefulness, even when you choose not to engage. And that changes how the world meets you. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but enough to matter. We'll bring this together gently. If there's one thing to hold on to as this comes to rest, it's this. Nothing about you was ever broken. You didn't misunderstand the value of effort. You simply weren't shown how effort is interpreted once it becomes constant. You weren't naive for believing that fairness would speak for itself. You were responding to a story that left out an important chapter. The chapter about containment. Hard work isn't wrong. Commitment isn't weakness. Reliability isn't a flaw. But when these qualities are offered without limit, without pause, without visible choice, they stop communicating self-respect. And when self-respect becomes unclear, respect from others quietly thins. That thinning can feel personal. It isn't. It's structural. Once you see that, the emotional charge begins to fade. You stop replaying old moments, wondering what you should have said differently. You stop trying to earn back something that was never taken from you intentionally. You begin to relate to effort as something you direct, not something that defines you. This is where calm returns. Not because everyone suddenly treats you perfectly, but because your sense of worth is no longer negotiated in real time. You know when your presence is aligned. You know when it isn't. And that knowledge steadies you. Respect, when it comes now, arrives quietly, in being consulted rather than assumed, in being given time rather than pressure, in being met with restraint instead of expectation. And when it doesn't come in certain places, you no longer internalize that absence as failure. You recognize it as information. Clarity replaces confusion, not in a way that hardens you, but in a way that preserves you. You don't need to withdraw from the world. You don't need to become guarded or cold. You simply move with proportion. You allow effort to have shape. You allow silence to exist. You let others carry what belongs to them. And in doing so, you remain intact. That was always the point. Not to force respect, not to demand recognition, but to move through systems without dissolving yourself into them. When effort comes from that place, it doesn't drain you. It doesn't erase you. It lands where it belongs. And that is enough to change everything quietly, over time.